Hello, everyone. I'm Gilbert Cruz, and this is the Book Review Podcast. Recently, two giants of modern American literature died within a single day of each other, the author Cormac McCarthy and the editor Robert Gottlieb. The two never worked together, but it's fascinating to me to imagine Gottlieb, who has argued with historian Robert Caro for half a century over punctuation marks, editing Cormac McCarthy, a man who rejected the use of quotation marks, semicolons, and other such frippery. Then again, as Gottlieb has said, the first thing editors have to remember is it's a service job. It's not your book. So, I don't know, maybe the two of them would have gotten along just fine. At any rate, it was a double blow for the world of books, and on this week's episode, we have members of the New York Times Book Review, present and former, to discuss the life, work, and influence of both men. First, our critic Dwight Garner, who wrote Cormac McCarthy's obituary, and then, after the break, a former editor of the Book Review who will recount a Bob Gottlieb story or two. So, Dwight, you wrote the obituary for Cormac McCarthy, who, starting with The Orchard Keeper way back in 1965 and ending with Stella Maris last year, wrote 12 novels. What was your relationship to him as a reader?
What a career. I remember, Gilbert, when I was just coming of age as a real reader. I mean, I came of age earlier than this, but it was like 1992, right, where he was discovered by the world. All the Pretty Horses was published by Alfred A. Knopf. There was a big PR push for All the Pretty Horses. And before that, no one really knew the name Cormac McCarthy. He had published 5 previous books, some of which were very dark and didn't sell well at all. And here comes this lush Western, dark in its way, but quite poetic and lovely in its way as well. And I picked it up and I didn't really love it. It wasn't quite my thing. And everyone else loved it. I don't begrudge anyone their fandom of All the Pretty Horses or its 2 sequels, The Crossing and Cities of the Plain. But I found them a little bit static for the kind of books I like to read, the kind of fiction. Then I went back and found out what an extraordinary writer he was in so many different directions. I mean, the darkness, the humor, the crazy wit in some of them. And there are many places to enter his work. For me, the Westerns weren't the right place, but I've gone back and I now see why they are so beloved.
You know, his career has quite an arc. For half of his career, before, as you say, 1992's All the Pretty Horses, he was a cult figure, and he wrote these 5 novels, which culminated with what is considered to be one of his best novels now, Blood Meridian. But the 4 before that, The Orchard Keeper, Outer Dark, Child of God, and Sutri. Sutri?
I always say Sutri, but I'm not positive.
Sutri?
I'm going to go with Sutri myself.
Sutri. Were incredibly dark, set in the South, mostly, as opposed to the West, where his later books were set. Tell us a little bit about those books.
The first one, The Orchard Keeper, which came out in 1965, was about a young boy and this bootlegger he befriended. A lot of McCarthy's novels are about young people who stumble into dark things. Cormac McCarthy doesn't really fall into what we call the dirty South, what we used to call it fiction writers, Richard Ford to some degree, and a lot of others. But the dirty South aesthetic, in many ways, people once described as the sensitive boy at a dogfight. And that was the style, like trying to see these rituals of the South, and of life, basically, but through sensitive eyes. And there's a certain amount of that in Cormac's work throughout what he did. A lot of young people being taken care of and cared for in his work. But anyway, the first 3 novels, The Orchard Keeper, Outer Dark, and Child of God are relentlessly bleak. I mean, we're talking incest and child's left in the woods, serial killers, very dark stuff. The funny thing, the outlier for me was always Sutri, which came out in 1979, which is a wild, raucous novel set in Knoxville, Tennessee, where Cormac mostly grew up. And it's sort of about the crazy river rats and men on the edge of society living in this town. And it's just wild. I mean, it's just the humor, all kinds of food and sex and music and humor and skullduggery. And for a lot of people in the early work, that was the novel a lot of people I know anyway really loved. And of course, the classic is Blood Meridian, which is one of the darkest books ever written.
So Blood Meridian is a capper to this phase of his career before the Border Trilogy. Everyone who's read Blood Meridian, let me take that back. Many people who read Blood Meridian consider it to be his great work, consider it to be one of the great works, great American works of the latter part of the 20th century. It's pretty dark. It's pretty ornately written. Tell us a little bit about Blood Meridian.
Well, again, you've got a fairly young boy, I think he's 14, who falls in with this band of sort of marauders who are hunting Native Americans in the 19th century. And there's this albino judge is involved, and there's just scalpings and beheadings. The whole thing is just the excess of the gore is just unbelievable. I mean, it really is a kind of parade, a pageant of gore. And part of it is just a writer like Cormac, whose favorite themes are man's inhumanity to man is probably his favorite theme, and just really going for it in this novel. I mean, as dark as you can get and enjoying it, rubbing the reader's faces in it, and yet it's just glorious. This language is glorious. The whole pageantry of it is glorious. It's Sweeney Todd for literati.
Is that why people like it so much? Because it is both incredibly written. We're going to talk about a style in a minute, but also over the top in a way that a lot of, quote, literature never gives itself permission to be.
It's true. Here we are. He had written, I think, 4 previous novels. None of them sold at all. And I just think he decided to write the book he wanted to write. And it is this sort of epic. Harold Bloom, the great critic, called it, I think he called it the best novel of the century, or at least the best novel since Faulkner, since I believe it's Absalom. And there's nothing quite like it in American literature, frankly.
So Blood Meridian comes out in 1985. And then, as you say, there really is at Knopf, which is where he was published, a push starting with All the Pretty Horses in 1992 to try to break him out. This is a man who had been writing for almost 30 years. None of his books had sold. And his editors decided this one is actually palatable enough that we can make this possibly into a successful book. All the Pretty Horses, again, about a young man living in Texas, goes down with a friend of his to Mexico. There's a lot of wonderful descriptions about how you break a horse. There's a little bit of a love story, incredible language, some violence. It's a great Western, or many people think it's a great Western. He writes The Crossing as a sequel, and then Cities of the Plain. Then he goes into sort of the last part of his career, which is No Country for Old Men, The Road, and then the 2 books he published last year. No Country for Old Men and The Road are, I think, in the minds of many, the books that they know. The Road won the Pulitzer, and it got him on Oprah, and No Country for Old Men was made into a movie that won Best Picture. Talk to me about the perhaps oddness of Cormac McCarthy becoming this incredibly popular author with those 2 books.
Well, of course, he became popular with All the Pretty Horses, but the movies found him. I guess the movie, they did film 2 of All the Pretty Horses. But I think, Gilbert, that No Country for Old Men, which came out in 2005, is probably the best entry point for most readers into the work of Cormac McCarthy. It just reads like a rocket. The story is so good. Most listeners have probably seen the movie because it's a great movie. I mean, I've probably seen it 7, 8, 9 times. Just a drug deal gone bad in the desert. And this indelible mass murderer, Chigger is his name in the book, and the sheriff, which is played by Tommy Lee Jones in the movie. But the novel really reads as well. I remember it came out in 2005. I just started fairly recently as a assigning editor at the New York Times Book Review. Actually, I'd been there 5 or 6 years before that. But it was the first Cormac that I had read, and I remember assigning it. And I remember picking this book up and not knowing what to expect, maybe expecting something more like All the Pretty Horses, and just having such a great time. I remember physically holding this book, going home one night on the commuter train and going, my God, this is really fun to read. And it's really dark. And The Road is similar. The Road is quite a slim novel, as many listeners will know, sort of a post-apocalyptic story, a father and his young son. And even though it's one of the darkest things you'll ever read, it has emotion to it, and it's slim, and it's poetical, and it just grabs you and won't let go.
Talk to me a little bit about his style, because I believe that is one of the things that anyone who reads 1 or 2 Cormac books will just remember. No quotation marks. Not really a fan of punctuation, certain types of punctuation, no apostrophes.
No apostrophes, no periods if he can get away with it. Running on and on. You talk about his style. Really, it was styles of Cormac. Early on, he was so indebted to Faulkner. By the time the Westerns came out, there was a lot of Hemingway in there. I described it in my obituary as lush taciturnity. This kind of sense that it was very clipped language, and yet it flowed. It was very ripe, and it was just rich. When writers try to write simply, many writers end up getting exposed by it. You realize they have nothing to say, or it just doesn't work for them. The great writers, Hemingway, of course, but also Cormac, when they simplify themselves, it just amplifies the magnitude, the magnificence of what they're doing. He's one of those writers who can write in that style. There's also this really ornate style that he gets in Blood Meridian in the darkest way, in Suttree in a comic way. In his later novels, the final 2 that came out just last fall, The Passenger and Stella Maris, The Passenger is another one of his sort of strange, galloping, comic, clotted, overstuffed. He's a putter-inner in some of the novels. He's a taker-outer. In these novels like The Passenger and Suttree, he's a putter-inner and just filled with jokes and observations about life and observations about everything to do with life, and they're just stuffed to the gills.
Dwight, correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe there's a story you told me once, if you're comfortable sharing, about watching Cormac on Oprah, or was that a different author?
Oh God, it was this was 2007, right? And I was at the book review, and the book review then, we were in the new building already. Okay, we're here in the new building on 8th Avenue. I heard that Cormac was going to be on Oprah, and I thought, my God, what a moment. So the book review staff had this ritual. We'd go out for drinks once a month at this bar around the corner called Jimmy's, and it's a boxing bar. It's called Jimmy's Corner. And I went over there and asked if they wouldn't mind if we took over their back room for the day to watch Cormac on Oprah. So the whole book review staff went over and we sat there. And I got to say, it was a little depressing. I mean, Cormac, this was a long time ago, 2007. And Cormac looked old. He didn't look comfortable in the spotlight. I really thought that he was somewhat close to death. And in fact, I was assigned his obituary to write it way back then. Cormac's obituary more than 10 years ago, and it's been waiting for him to run. I mean, of course, I hoped he would live quite a long time, and he did. But I certainly didn't expect two really rather grand final novels that he published last fall. I thought he looked half out of the game 13, 14, 15 years ago.
From what I understand, not having seen the Oprah interview live, and he was on Oprah because she picked the road for Oprah's book club, he was uncomfortable because he hated to do press. The number of profiles that he did over the course of the prime of his life can be counted on one hand. He just did not like being out there, and he was able to get away with it.
No, it's true. He didn't. But you hear stories. I mean, people who knew him claim that he was quite a raconteur and he was funny. And, he had a life. He wasn't just a hermit living in a dirty hotel room his whole life in a Motel 6 or whatever. And I think he could have charmed Oprah had he wanted to. I just think he wasn't in the mood. He didn't need to charm Oprah, and that wasn't really who he was.
Dwight, you wrote a piece late last year following the publication of The Passenger and Stella Maris, those two interlinked novels, about food in the work of Cormac McCarthy. And it's a very specific your take, which is why I thought it was great, because it identified something in his work that you, as a critic, wanted to elevate and discuss. I'd love for you to tell us a little bit about that piece and why you were compelled to write it.
I've always been really aware of the food scenes at Cormac. I think you're really aware of them. One is because his fiction is so relentlessly dark that food is sometimes the only bearable aspect to an unbearable life or an unbearable moment in these characters' lives. And some of the scenes around fires in the Westerns and in the early work are quite memorable. In a novel like Suttree, a lot of the scenes are set in a diner, in a kind of roadhouse diner. And Cormac's characters have always liked diners. There's the American, the place to go, and the quintessential sort of hitchhiker, truck driver meal of a coffee and a slice of pie is kind of a Cormac character kind of thing. And I started thinking about it for real. And of course, there were really disgusting moments, for example, in The Road, where these characters are keeping human beings alive in a basement so they can slowly consume their flesh. I mean, things like, you don't forget that kind of scene. But I really thought about it because in the novel that came out last fall, The Passenger, it's set largely in New Orleans, and Cormac's hero, Billy Western, is a lover of the cuisine, and he doesn't really pay very often, and he only really eats finally if someone else is paying. If he's by himself, he'll have a burger, but he goes to a lot of the city's best restaurants and drinks at some of the best bars, and there are a lot of really charming, funny scenes about food and pleasure.
And humor, it's funny to hear you say funny, because humor is not something that really is associated much with Cormac McCarthy.
Oh, he's one of the funniest writers who's ever lived. He's just a jokester. And you don't always feel it. I mean, you'll feel it sometimes like poking out of the rocks in the darker stuff. But in at least 3 or 4 of the novels, they are just hilarious. I mean, I'm looking at a quote that I have written down, and there's characters going after each other in The Passenger. And one of them describes the other as, quote, an habitual male candler and a molester of domestic wildfowl. The molester of domestic wildfowl. And I remember thinking, wow, that's a put down, and that's the kind of the way the characters talk to each other. And he's really funny.
Now, you were able, through writing that essay on food in Cormac McCarthy, to get a brief response, a brief correction from Mr. McCarthy, as I recall.
Oh, God. This is the second time. I feel that I'm not really some kind of super sleuth. I don't care if writers make mistakes in their novels. It doesn't matter. It's a novel. But as it happens, I've now twice called out Cormac in print. I'm humiliated to say this because it's not really my thing. But when he wrote... Oh, God, it was No Country for Old Men. In the very first scene, I'm going to get this wrong, Gilbert, because you've got me trying to remember. But in the first sentence of No Country for Old Men, a character is sent, I believe, to the gas chamber in Texas. And it turns out, someone pointed out online, Texas never executed anyone with the gas chamber and through the gas chamber. And Cormac is so detailed, and you just know that he would hate to get that wrong. And so we ended up getting in touch with him, and he somehow admitted that he gave us a quote about it. Then, and more recently, this is really stupid as well, in The Passenger, he has a character eat at this great restaurant outside of New Orleans, Mosca's, which is a great old Italian roadhouse. It's very unpretentious, the kind of place where the lighting's bad, but it's just one of those great old school restaurants. And he has a character order, a clam dish that the restaurant has never served. And it just struck me like, why, Cormac, why would you do this? Why would you? And clams don't grow around New Orleans, for one thing, because of the water, et cetera, et cetera. So I asked him through his publicist, and he gave some really funny quote. "Oh my God, I got it wrong. Put a note at the bottom of the page. Let people know." And he was a funny, grumpy response, but I felt kind of ridiculous in both cases. But it's funny. It does interest me because Cormac is one of those writers who clearly goes to great lengths to get things right.
So many people hold McCarthy up as one of the best living American writers until last week. But the knock on him by his detractors was that he was too much. His style was too much. The violence was too much. The overwhelming maleness of his books, too much. What is the takeaway from you as you look back on 12 novels, a couple screenplays? How do you think his legacy is going to be understood years from now?
I do think he's a writer who's going to be read for as long as serious books are read in this world. I see all the criticisms against him. There used to be this kind of figure in American literature that's largely passed away that we used to call the nifty guy at loose ends. And the nifty guy at loose ends was these characters you'd find in Thomas McGuane, Richard Ford, Jim Harrison, Cormac, kind of a unmarried, good-looking guy kicking around. Maybe things haven't gone so well for him. Kind of a loser, but a winner. And just the things that this character falls into, the nifty guy. And Cormac brought that nifty guy back a bit in The Passenger, but he mocks him as well. But I think that people are going to read Cormac for these, first of all, you read him for the great dark themes. You read him for his pure intuitive sense of what life is like on this planet and frankly, what death is like. I take away from him this cosmic slyness. I'm a big fan of the humor in Cormac, and the books that I return to are the funnier and slyer ones. But just when you call him Faulknerian in terms of his genius, I think that's not a bad comparison. I think he is very close to Faulkner in terms of his deserved reputation. And I think there are enough different kinds, almost like Faulkner too, enough different kinds of Cormac books, enough different ways for people to enter his work that people will keep finding new ways to enter into it. And I believe that scholars will keep making crisscross tracks through these novels for as long as we're reading.
Dwight, you always make me understand the writer better when I talk to you. Thank you so much for being on the podcast today to talk all things Cormac McCarthy.
It was fun, Gilbert. Thank you.
We'll be right back. Welcome back to the Book Review Podcast. I'm Gilbert Cruz, and I'm now joined by two guests. One is a former captain of this ship, erstwhile host of this very show. Pamela Paul is here to talk about the legendary editor and a friend of hers, Bob Gottlieb. Joining us is Emily Eakin, an editor here at the Book Review, and someone who worked over the last few years on several of Bob's final essays for the Times. Pamela, welcome back to the podcast.
I'm so happy to be here with you, new host.
Emily?
Not so new host.
Emily, thanks for being here.
Great to be here with you, both of you.
So, Pamela, you are back on the pod. Different seat. We can switch if you want, but how's it feel?
It feels very nice to be in this chair, actually, and to see you very comfortable in your own seat. I've missed it here. I've missed our listeners.
Well, we're happy to have you back. As the three of us know, particularly when it comes to book publishing, editors are almost always behind the scenes. Bob Gottlieb, however, is a rare example of someone who wasn't. Pamela, who was he and how did that come to pass?
So I can talk a little bit about him generally, and I can also talk about how I came to know him, which is how I think of him at this point. Bob Gottlieb, Robert Gottlieb, is well known as an editor. He was an editor first at Simon & Schuster, where he rose to the top seat, the editor-in-chief, publisher of Simon & Schuster. He then was lured by Cy Newhouse to become the editor of The New Yorker, briefly replacing the legendary William Shawn, which was a very tough spot to be put in because that magazine had very established modes of working and a very closely knit staff. And he came in as this outsider from the book world. So he was not there for a very long time before he was replaced by Tina Brown and then later on by David Remnick, who wrote a nice appreciation of Bob in The New Yorker recently and talks about that period in his life. And then he went to Alfred A. Knopf, known as Knopf, part of Penguin Random House, where he also became editor-in-chief. He was there working alongside many legendary figures in the book world, including Toni Morrison, who was a colleague of his, and later on he was her longtime editor and good friend. He's also the editor of Robert Caro, the other Bob Caro, and he was in the middle of editing Bob's expected 5-volume biography of Lyndon Johnson. So many questions, of course, hang, or I should say one big question hangs in the minds probably of many readers about what and when they can expect to read that final book. And a lot of people probably know about the close collaboration between the two Bobs because Robert Gottlieb, Bob Gottlieb's daughter, Lizzie Gottlieb, recently made a documentary. I think the working title was Bob and Bob, although the final film is called Turn Every Page. And it's really about the relationship between Bob Gottlieb and Bob Caro.
So the relationship between Bob and Bob, Caro and Gottlieb, is one of the defining aspects of his life to many people, even though, as you alluded to, he edited so many famous writers. So in addition to Toni Morrison, he worked with Michael Crichton, he worked with John Cheever. Sorry, listeners, this is going to be like a list. Nora Ephron, John le Carré, Doris Lessing, V.S. Naipaul, Salman Rushdie, and then Robert Caro on these books, right? So it started with The Power Broker, and then through 4 volumes of this Lyndon Johnson biography series. And they're working on the 5th, or they were working on the 5th. And one of the things, having watched Turn Every Page last week, I took away from the documentary was there was this great concern over whether the both of them were going to make it to the finish line. Bob Caro takes his time. That's why his books are so wonderfully written, richly detailed, amazingly reported. But he takes his time, and he's in the middle of Volume 5, which deals with Lyndon Johnson and Vietnam and a bunch of other stuff. And unfortunately, Bob Gottlieb is not going to be around to finish this series. He worked with this guy for 50 years. It's an amazing partnership that they seem to have had.
One thing I just realized, even in that brief overview of his biography that I left out on Bob Gottlieb, is that he was also an amazing writer. And he wrote a number of books. He wrote many essays over the course of his lifetime for the New York Review of Books, for the New Yorker, for the New York Times Book Review. I know Emily Eakin, our colleague here, will talk a little bit about her working relationship with him. He adored Emily. But he also wrote a memoir. And one of the things I loved about this memoir, which is called Avid Reader, and this is the way that I eventually met Bob myself, is that as with many memoirs, there are 2 sections of photo inserts. And the first is about him and his colleagues and his life. And the second is about the books that he published. So among other authors that he edited were Jessica Mitford, Joseph Heller, Barbara Tuchman. He was still editing Bill Gates as of last year. He edited Bill Clinton. So he edited a wide range, and he had a wide range of interests as well. So he could get equally excited about Lyndon Johnson or about Robert Moses, the subject of Bob Caro's first book, as he was about the ballet. He was a longtime dance critic, and he wrote several books about ballet, and even like things like Miss Piggy's Guide to Life, which he famously edited. He loved TV. I always got my TV recommendations from Bob. He was, I would say, in all things, a great enthusiast. And one of the I think misconceptions about Bob, which may just have been about his demeanor on the outside, because he was really very no frills. He worked at his desk. He went to a deli when I had lunch with him. I think the fanciest place we went to was the Oyster Bar, but we regularly would go to the diner around the corner from where he lived in Turtle Bay in Manhattan. But he looked like this kind of gruff guy, so people thought he was a curmudgeon, but he was really the opposite of a curmudgeon. And Emily is smiling here. He was impish, mischievous, and enthusiast in all things. He was quick to smile. He definitely had strong opinions, including very firm negative opinions. But most of all, he loved to talk about what he loved, and he loved the work that he did as an editor.
I would just add, I totally agree, Pamela. I think enthusiast is the word that sums him up. He was not a snob. He was a champion of the demotic in all things. He loved culture. And he was just unfussy. What he valued, as he said in his essay about Booth Tarkington in The New Yorker, which is one of the last pieces he wrote, one, I think it came out in 2019, that Tarkington was unpretentious, literate, but unshowy. And I think those were Bob's values. He said in Avid Reader, I can write perfectly well. Anybody who's educated can write perfectly well. And that was the attitude that he brought to his own work and to the writers he edited.
And I think one of the most striking qualities about his own writing is that it was unfussy. It was so readable. No matter what he was writing about, his last book was about Greta Garbo, and I don't have any particular interest in Greta Garbo, and yet he was so enthusiastic about this project while he was working on it, and he was constantly berating me for not having watched the films that he insisted I watch. But from the very first sentence, you're drawn in because his work, his own writing is so readable.
That's exactly right. He championed the conversational writing that was entertaining, had a sort of low-key, subtle wit, but again, nothing extravagant. He didn't reach for elaborate metaphors. He had no tolerance for things like that. He wanted writing to be accessible and a pleasure, as reading clearly was for him the greatest pleasure of his life.
In the intro to this podcast, I wonder aloud at what it would have been like for Bob Gottlieb to edit Cormac McCarthy, which if he fought with Bob Caro over semicolons, how would he fight with a writer who never used semicolons or whose style was one of the things that defined him most? What was it like for you, Emily, to edit the editor, an editor?
It was a very interesting experience. It was, as you can imagine, unnerving. I'm not sure how Pamela persuaded him to work with me. Obviously, he needed an editor. He had a lot of say in the pieces that he did for us. He wrote maybe 5 essays over the last, I would say, 3-4 years, ending really in the middle of the pandemic, and he chose the subjects. And I assume when we first spoke, I only met Bob once in person to deliver a manuscript that he could not access on his email. And so I spent only about 5 minutes with him face to face, but we talked on the phone, and we talked literally for hours. Clearly what he wanted was a dialogue. That's what he had with the writers he edited. And so that's what he wanted with his editor. And I assume that initial conversation was a test to see whether I knew about commas and maybe most important, what kind of ear I had for language. Because, of course, the pieces that Bob turned in were clean and sharp and conversational. They were pretty much ready to go. And the hardest thing we had to do probably was trim to fit. And we had actually a little running joke about trimming. He told me a story. He and Janet Malcolm were very good friends. In fact, I think they were neighbors whose houses their gardens, I think, were back to back. And Bob was often over at Janet's house for dinner. And Janet had a cat. And the way I remember this story is that the cat even sat in a chair at the dining room table. The cat's name was Gaspard. The cat had a reputation. Janet claimed the cat could meow on command. And Janet would turn to the cat and say, "Do it, Gaspard, do it." And the cat would meow. And so Bob told me this story when we were fussing over whether to cut an adjective or a sentence or a phrase. And I would say, "Do it, Gaspard, do it." And we would say this to each other. And it was just, this was the kind of thing that Bob, I assume, had with his writers, this kind of inside dialogue and playful rapport. It was just a pleasure working with him.
2 things. One is the first way that I persuaded him to write for us, to answer your question, is that I said length was no issue because Bob felt adamant as an editor foremost. He thought of himself as an editor much more so than as a writer, as good as he was at that. And so he felt he knew the right length for something to be. And so I said, you write as long as you want and we'll run it, which probably set you up for a little bit of a tussle, Emily. But I remember Bob edited so many books that I would sometimes come across a book and only realize he edited it when I got to the afterword or the acknowledgments. And I was reading a couple of years ago the book The Chosen by Chaim Potok, which I'd never read. It was a 50th anniversary issue. So lo and behold, I get to the end and there's a little afterword from Bob Gottlieb. And he may have told this story in the afterword, but he also told it to me, which is that book came in and there were two problems. One is that it was two books, not one. And so he said, you have to chop out the second half. So it was just gone, speaking of cutting. So he really had a very clear mind. And the other is that it didn't have a good title. And I believe that they ended up getting the title by asking someone, and now I'm forgetting who, in the elevator what the title should be. He said it's about Judaism, it's about baseball, it's about coming of age. And whoever it was in the elevator said, you call it The Chosen. And Bob said, okay. The title originally was nothing remotely like that. And another famous title, of course, change that he oversaw was Catch-22 by Joseph Heller, which was originally famously Catch-18, but another book came out that season with that title. And then one other thing that I want to mention about the phone is that the biggest problem in my friendship with Bob, and he really felt was a moral failure on my part, is that I don't like talking on the phone. I only like to see him in person, and he loves talking on the phone. And after I was working on my most recent book, he said, send it to me. I will give it a read and let you know what I think. And he said, I was expecting to get, an editorial note or something in writing, which he had done for an earlier book of mine that he had read for me when it was in copy edits. But instead, he said, when can you talk? So I thought, okay, I guess we're going to go over this by phone. We were on the phone for hours and hours. And I remember at a certain point, I said to him, Bob, can I call you back? I just need 5 minutes. And he said, why? And I said, I have to go to the bathroom. And he said, just put the phone down. I'll wait.
Typical.
Yes, maybe that happened to you. You don't have to reveal that here, Emily.
So, Emily, two of the pieces that he wrote for the book review were about Sinclair Lewis. He wrote about Babbitt on the occasion of its 100th anniversary. He also wrote about Charles Dickens. What was it about the things that he wrote for the book review in your mind that that led to an understanding of the type of things that he liked?
Yeah, that's a good question. I was thinking about the pieces that he wrote at the end this morning, and he wrote about Sinclair Lewis, Charles Dickens, John Gunther, a journalist who famously visited every state in America, wrote down notes about everything he saw, and then published a 900-page book called Inside USA. And when Bob's piece came out about this book in the Times Book Review, the book, which he had been out of print, and he said, please, publishers, get this book back into print. And Pamela, am I right in thinking that someone subsequently did?
Yes,
immediately?
The New Press put it out, a new edition, which came out, I believe it was last year or the year before.
And I think it actually sold out. Anyway, this was the kind of clout that Bob had. When Bob said something should be read, people listened.
And people read it at the book review. The pieces he did were among our most read pieces.
So thinking about the kind of writers he chose to write about, I thought there is a common theme. These were writers who were literary, but they were also commercial. They had best-selling books. They won literary prizes, Pulitzers. They were not experimentalists. They were not avant-garde writers. He loved telling us that Booth Tarkington won the Pulitzer Prize twice, which put him in a category with only John Updike and Faulkner at the time, and now Colson Whitehead has also won it twice. And he was fascinated by that issue. How could a writer be both serious and important and also successful and accessible? I think that's a running theme through these pieces. He loved to include tallies on sales figures and prizes, how writers were ranked and rewarded by the public. He loved to track how reputations ascended and fell. I remember this essay he wrote about Harold Bloom. He reviewed Harold Bloom's last book, which was essentially a ranking of Harold Bloom's greatest novels. And it was an argument with Harold Bloom. That was the essay. Bob disagreed. How could Bloom leave out Middlemarch, for God's sake? He loved to include biography. All his essays reminded us of who the writer was and what were the formative influences and where had the writer come from. And Lewis was a terribly bookish boy. His favorite authors were Dickens, Scott, and Kipling. When I reread this morning, my eyes lit up because, of course, Bob writes in his essay on Dickens, he thinks Dickens is the greatest novelist in English and also the most popular. Those things were very important to him. He sent me a beautiful edition of the collected works of Kipling. Kipling was also a very important writer to Bob. And he goes on about Lewis. He may well have been the most widely and deeply read person of his era. Now, who does that remind you of?
Yeah.
Bob himself. I do think there was some identification going on.
I want to say one thing about Charles Dickens also because he wrote a book about Charles Dickens called Great Expectations, The Sons and Daughters of Charles Dickens. And Dickens, as you know, had many children and was not a great husband, to be sure, and not necessarily a great parent either. But Bob considered this to be his parenting book. This was a book, he said, ultimately about parenting. And he was in analysis for a long time. He was actually for someone who wasn't interested so much in subjects who really wrote about their interior lives, he was very interested in that side of him. And I do think it's interesting. Until he was first hospitalized, he had never been hospitalized in his life. He was so fit and healthy and very proud of it. And in January, when I last saw him, he was showing off again about he had never been sick, never broken a bone. And I feel that even though I had no expectation, I thought he would be with us for at least 5 more years, that his daughter having made this film, I think about him was so important to have had happened in the course of his lifetime. When I saw the film, I thought this is really a love letter from a daughter to her father. I don't know if you had that same reaction, but I almost feel like he had written Garbo, which to him was a real passion project, his last book, which came out within the last year. He had this film come out about him made by his daughter. He had said in the last months of his life that he was done writing. And so, I don't know, somehow I think that having had those things happen in this last period of his life, and he also said, Emily, that writing for the book review in the last few years had been the most joyful and wonderful, reinvigorating thing for him in a long time. I feel like even though his death at 92 was premature, it to me felt like at least these things had come to him in the last few years.
Pamela, you knew Bob for a while. I was wondering if you had just one sort of personal story that comes to mind whenever you think of your friend.
Yes. So I read Avid Reader on vacation in Vermont and immediately fell in love not only with the book, but really with Bob, who had only met once before at a book party and been really intimidated by him because he came up and told me many, many things that he felt like were wrong with the world. And when I say the world, I mean the world of books. And after I read that book, however, I felt like I knew him and I really identified with him. I felt like we were very much the same. And so I asked one of my predecessors and your predecessors at the book review, Chip McGrath, who was a close friend of Bob's, if I could have his email. And I wrote out this just painstaking but heartfelt kind of love letter to him. And we went to lunch. And that lunch we just immediately hit it off. And I mentioned that I had just written a memoir about books. And he said, send it to me. And I said, send copy edits. He's like, send it to me. So I email it to him and I wake up the next morning to an email that has been composed in the middle of the night. And it is a very long editorial note from him telling me, absolutely, you cannot use this sentence. This has to come out, but he ended by saying, and I would like to write a blurb for this. And it was too late for blurbs, but he wrote a blurb and he said, just get them to put it on Amazon, which they did. And so I just want to say that one of the things about Bob is that he was adorable, and he called himself, I think, adorable in the film that his daughter made of him, about him. And he was lovable. And the last conversation we had in January, I had written a column about that film. And in that column, I said, I consider Bob a friend. And I was very nervous what he would say about this column afterwards. I didn't want to be presumptuous. He called me up, of course, and to my chagrin. And he said, I have one very big problem with this column that you wrote. And I was like trembling, like, uh-oh, what did I do? And he said, you said, I consider Bob a friend, and that's wrong. I am your friend, and that's what you should have written.
He achieved a level of fame, as we said at the beginning, that is pretty rare among editors these days. And Pamela, I'd like to close by asking you about your observations of the role of the book editor now. What it means to be a book editor, particularly at a major publishing house now, is very different from what it meant when Bob Gottlieb was coming up and when he was in his prime. The job of being a book editor, just day to day, is very different. And it's hard to imagine that a Bob Gottlieb, all the time that he would spend with Robert Caro, 5 hours in the office, would be able to flourish in the way that he did.
And one of the great things about Bob is that he was delighted in every aspect of the book. Everything from the editing of the grammar. And when I went over to the book with him by the phone, he would say, page 77, this should be a comma, take out that comma. It was very granular, to larger conceptual edits, to the book cover. And that's why in his memoir, he has that second insert of photos. I wanted more from his life, but he put those in because he was very involved in the title, in the cover design, in the packaging. Garbo, this book, and I think when he came on the podcast to talk about the book, we talked about this as a physical object. In that podcast, it's a very heavy book. It's beautifully produced. His publisher was FSG, Forrest Strauss and Giroux, and he insisted on having a certain paperweight, a certain quality of the photographs, number of photos in the pages. And he said, because I am who I am, they have to agree. He didn't have a small ego. He knew what he was good at and what he wasn't good at, but what he was great at was everything having to do with the book. He was a great publisher. He was interested in the industry. He was fascinated by what hit the bestseller list, as Emily said. And I think that kind of grand vision is very rare. I think that it's really hard to be all things in an industry which consists of many specializations. I mean, there are people who are great publicists and great editors and great people managers, and it's very rare to find all of that in one person. And Bob, I think, was good at all of it. And that, I think, in an era when publishing has become very corporate, and that was a subject that Bob was a little obsessed with, the effect of the bottom line and just that narrow vision as opposed to that larger vision, I think has made doing that kind of job in the way that Bob Gottlieb did it much harder. And I also think it's rare to find someone who was gifted in all of those ways.
Emily, thank you so much for coming on to talk about working with Bob Gottlieb.
My pleasure.
And Pamela, thank you so much for remembering your friend and talking about this great editor, and for coming back on. It's been a minute.
It's been really fun. Thanks so much, Gilbert.
Those were my conversations with Dwight Garner about the author Cormac McCarthy, and Pamela Paul and Emily Eakin talking about the editor Bob Gottlieb. I'm Gilbert Cruz, editor of the New York Times Book Review. Thank you for listening.